Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Philip Goff, and we're going to talk about the purpose of the universe. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm looking forward to our conversation. This is my first podcast of 2025, and I've decided to celebrate that. I'm going to have a mustache just for this podcast.
It looks great. It looks great. And I'm looking forward to hearing about your book, which is about the purpose of the universe. It's a very grand question, a very foundational question that I think is very apt for a philosopher to think about and try to answer. So I was hoping that you could kind of give the core argument.
Yeah, it is a bit of a big question. I wouldn't have thought 5 years ago I'd be writing a book arguing that there's a purpose to the universe. But yeah, I've got this nasty habit of following the arguments where they lead, and this is kind of where I've ended up. I think this started just when I first started teaching philosophy of religion, and you get dragged into this never ending debate between theists and atheists, people who believe in the traditional, at least in Western religion, all knowing, all powerful, perfectly good creator of the universe, and then traditional atheists who believe it's all meaningless, purposeless, at least at the level of the whole universe. Humans can maybe have meaning and purpose, but the universe as a whole is just this meaningless brute fact. And I just came to think that actually both sides of this debate had something right and something wrong, that there's things both sides struggle to explain. And actually, what we've neglected is the middle ground in between. That is to say, views on which there is a purpose to the universe in some sense, but in the absence of the very traditional idea of God. And that's basically what my book is arguing for, arguing that there's some arguments for God that are pretty good, some arguments against God that are pretty good. And where this points us is to this middle ground option of what we might call cosmic purpose without God. And then at the end of the book, I sort of think, how does that impact our lives, if at all?
Let's kind of dive a little deeper into it, right? You're saying that there are certain questions that traditional religions cannot answer or have trouble answering, and questions that atheists have trouble answering. And you're saying that there's something kind of in between. So let's start with the former. What are some of the questions that religions have trouble answering?
Well, maybe not religions in general, but at least religions such as the Abrahamic faiths of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, who are at least usually seen as believing in what philosophers tend to call the omni-God, a being that is all-knowing, omniscient, all-powerful, omnipotent, and perfectly good. And the classic thing that this view struggles to explain is, why the hell is there suffering? Right? If our universe is created and sustained by a loving being who can do absolutely anything, why is there such horrible suffering that we see on our screens every day? Just tuning into the news before it came on, thankfully there's perhaps a ceasefire in Gaza has cheered me up a little bit, but obviously that's one example of horrific suffering we've all been seeing. But even moving outside of the human realm, the natural world, where we've been brought into existence by this horrific process of evolution by natural selection, survival of the fittest, is just filled the natural world with pain and suffering, as well as all the wonderful things about it. So it's obviously a huge debate, but I just think it's very, very hard to understand why a loving being who could do anything would allow that suffering to maintain.
Yeah, I think the problem of evil is problem for me as well, and one of the reasons why I'm not religious. So it seems like the problem is not necessarily why there is evil. I would feel like there's a variation of that problem, which is that why is there the amount of evil that we see, right? Because you would think that a perfectly good God, an all powerful, all knowing God wouldn't there would have to be some justification for this level of suffering, right? So there has to be a reason why there has been and there will be and this number of natural disasters, right? Why couldn't there have been an Earth with one fewer natural disaster, right? So it's I feel like it's a little more specific than that too. Okay, so problem of evil. Okay, that's a problem with the big religions. What is the hard questions that atheists cannot answer?
Yeah, I think you're right in what you just said. It's the amount of evil. I mean, there are these explanations like free will that can maybe do some of the job, but did it really have to be so much? Did it really have to be so unevenly distributed? And how does it even most of the solutions about humans having free will or challenges, how does that apply to the horrors in the animal kingdom? Yes, but anyway, but but I do think also there are things traditional atheism struggles to explain. And by traditional atheism, I mean the view that the universe as a whole is purposeless. And perhaps the most easy to get onto in the first instance is the fine tuning of physics for life. This is the surprising discovery of recent decades that for life to be possible, certain numbers in our physics had to fall in a certain very, very narrow range. If they'd been slightly bigger or they'd been slightly smaller, life would be impossible. So a little bit like Goldilocks porridge, you have to be just right. And on the face of it, this just looks incredibly improbable. I mean, physicists attach certain probabilities to how likely is it that you get these right numbers just by a chance, that it's more than astronomical, more than astronomically improbable that you get the right numbers just by chance. And so, I think in our normal ways of thinking about evidence, this does look to be evidence for some kind of goal directedness towards life in the very early universe. And to be honest, I think I honestly believe we're somewhat in denial about this as a culture because we've just got so used to the idea that science has ruled out all that sort of nonsense. This is just not scientific. But the evidence has changed, and it's hard to get a cultural shift to accept that. I feel a bit kind of it's silly talking about these things. I think our scientific intellectual cultures just can't really make sense of that kind of evidence. But, one of my heroes, the economist Keynes, when a journalist once said to him, "You didn't used to believe that." And he said, "Well, when the facts change, I change my view. What do you do, sir?" But I think that's something human beings find very difficult. And I honestly think something like that's going on with the fine tuning of physics for life. So that's one big example I focus on a lot in the book.
Yeah, I've heard of the fine tuning problem. I don't have a background in physics, so I don't have a deep understanding of it, but I do accept that it is very, very, very improbable that the laws of nature are just right such that life could emerge, right? That seems very unlikely. What do you think about the response that says, well, perhaps that there are an infinite number of universes, and this is just the one that happens to have life in it. So of course, we're not necessarily fine-tuned, but we just by chance happen to be in that universe.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I'm not a physicist either, and I wouldn't be waging into a controversial area of physics because of that. I don't have the skills. I mean, I talk a lot and work with physicists increasingly, but not being a physicist myself, I wouldn't be like arguing for a contentious view in physics. But actually, this isn't controversial physics, right? This is broadly accepted that at least on our current scientific theories, for life to arise, these numbers had to be just right. That much is pretty broadly agreed. I mean, I find people are really surprised when they hear this, especially on Twitter, where people shout at me about this all the time, and I like wind people up by comparing denial of it to denial of climate change. But anyway, so what is controversial and what is more in my skill set is, well, what follows from this? How should we understand this? And that's where my skills as a philosopher who understands our standard ways of thinking about evidence and probabilistic reasoning. And I'm trying to push that, just in our normal ways of thinking about evidence, this is evidence for goal directedness. But yeah, Jason, you raised there's a very important other possibility to consider here. So, I mean, scientists and physicists have different, and philosophers have different reactions to this problem. Um, but many do think it needs explaining. But before turning to God or cosmic purpose, they think there's another explanation. Maybe there's just lots and lots of universes with different numbers in their physics. And if you've got enough variety, then statistically, one of the universes at least is going to fluke the right numbers for life. Right? If enough people play the lottery, someone's going to win. And this is the view I myself accepted for many years. I've always thought the fine tuning needed explaining, but this seemed the more rational explanation. And it was only when I, as I said earlier, started teaching philosophy of religion that I discovered that there is a literature in philosophy of probability journals going back decades that actually argues that there's some really dodgy reasoning going on in the attempt to explain fine tuning in terms of a multiverse. And I wrestled with this for months, if not years, and I was eventually persuaded by it. And well, before I get on to that, I mean, one of the things I want to do with this book is get this out to a broader audience, because there is huge interest in fine tuning among maybe physicists arguing for a multiverse or religious people arguing for God. And this, to my mind, very compelling argument that the multiverse just can't deal with it is really very little known. So that's one thing I'm trying to do with the book. Anyway, should I go into a little bit more detail about what the dodgy reasoning's supposed to be?
Yeah, why don't you give an example of that, and then I want to hear your proposal of how to kind of like combine the truth of both sides.
Yeah, so the claim is that the multiverse commits to what's called the inverse gambler's fallacy. So there's a huge argument here that can get technical, but we can give the essential point with a nice analogy. So suppose you and I go to a casino tonight, Jason, and as we walk in the door, go into a small room when we first get in there, and there's just one person playing roulette, and they're winning really big. They're just winning and winning, and it's absolutely incredible. There's an incredible run of luck. And I turn to you and I say, wow, the casino must be really full tonight. And you turn to me and say, Philip, what the hell are you talking about? We've just seen this one person in this one room. How do you know what else is going on in the casino? And I say, well, if there's tens of thousands of people playing in the casino, then it's not so surprising that someone's going to win big. And that's just what we've observed. Someone winning big. Right now, pretty much everybody, I met someone recently who doesn't think, there's always one philosopher, isn't there? But anyway, pretty much everyone thinks that's bad reasoning. It's it's a sort of backwards version of the traditional gambler's fallacy that people might have come across. But it's, our evidence concerns this particular individual. Let's call him Bob. And, no matter how many people there are or aren't playing elsewhere in the casino, that has no bearing on whether Bob's likely to win big or not. So everyone agrees that's the inverse gambler's fallacy. But, it looks like strikingly similar reasoning of the multiverse theorist, at least if they're just going from fine tuning to a multiverse. They think, find these numbers in physics. Oh my gosh, they're just right for life. Wow. There must be loads of other universes with crap numbers. Well, it looks like exactly the same. Our evidence is this universe, and it's fine tuned for life. No matter how many universes there are or aren't out there with different numbers, it has no bearing on the probability that our universe is going to have the right numbers for life, and that's what our evidence is. So there's a striking parallel between these two cases. Now, I'm sure there's lots of ways we could go with this discussion, but that's the way into the starting point and thinking, this is just not a good inference, really.
Okay. So I'm willing to grant that it's like very, very improbable. So, and I'm also just generally in terms of my personality, I'm also willing to grant and want to see the truth in different perspectives and positions. So I already kind of like the starting point of this book. Okay. I want to have a better understanding of how you combine the truth of both sides as you see it.
Yeah, good. Well, I mean, just before, very quickly before we move on, I'm sure maybe listeners and viewers will be thinking of all sorts of objections, like what about the anthropic selection effect, or what about anyway, all sorts of. So one thing I do in the book is actually each chapter is divided into just a very accessible introduction to the argument, and then a digging deep a bit. And then the fine tuning chapter, I go through all the objections I've ever heard or read and respond to them. So yeah. So what's the middle way? What's the middle way? So I think, look, the fine tuning points to some kind of directedness towards, let's say, life, or it might be something broader. I mean, the traditional God is one way of making sense of that, right? One way of making sense of that, that the traditional God created the world and ensured the numbers were right. But there are other possibilities. And so I think the traditional God could deal with fine tuning, but then it can't deal very well with suffering, right? It doesn't fit very well with that data. So what we need is something that can accommodate both data points, both fine tuning and suffering. And I explore basically three options, just to catalog them very briefly. I mean, perhaps the very straightforward is just a slightly tweaked God, right? So maybe it's a bad God rather than a good God. Maybe it's one of, well, the hypothesis I like most, actually, a God of limited powers. So a God who's made the best universe they can. Maybe they can't just create intelligent life from in an instant, but the only way they can create it is create a universe with the right physics. It's going to evolve it, and it's going to be messy. And God's like, I'm sorry, it's going to be a mess. It's going to be like, is this or nothing? Sorry. Or maybe we're in a simulation. Maybe the designer of our universe is some software engineer just trying to test some things out, and so simulates a universe and with all the messiness. So they're sort of non-standard design hypotheses. But it's not obvious you do need a conscious mind for purpose. So it sounds strange at first. How could you have purpose without? But if purpose is just goal directedness, a sort of tendency towards some future goal, maybe that could just be a fundamental fact about the universe, that it's directed towards certain goals without there being a mind underpinning all that. And in fact, some philosophers have given really detailed, rigorous accounts of what so-called teleological laws of nature might look like. So that's telos, the Greek word for goal or purpose. So sort of laws of nature with goals built into them. So that's one possibility, just a sort of fundamental tendency or directedness in reality. And the third option, which I guess fits with, well, what we haven't mentioned thus far, what most of my work's been on, is defending an odd view known as panpsychism, where consciousness is somehow part of the fundamental foundations of the physical universe. And one form of that is cosmopsychism, where the universe itself is a conscious mind. Sounds quite extravagant, but I try to argue that's actually not as extravagant a hypothesis as it might first sound. Now, if you've got a conscious universe already and you're trying to deal with this fine tuning, well, maybe you don't need to postulate a supernatural designer outside the universe. If you can just think, well, maybe the universe is a conscious being that has its own goals. Maybe in some sense it fine-tuned itself. So they're the three options I consider, really: non-standard designers, teleological laws or purpose-driven, purpose involving laws of nature, and a conscious universe that designed itself.
Okay.
Any of them any good to you? Which one do you want to buy?
I don't know. So let's think about the first one. Let's say that there is some sort of God, but he, is not all powerful, not all good, which is hard for me to, I mean, like conceptually, I understand that, but I can imagine many people, if not most people, just simply rejecting that because we're so used to defining God in terms of his, omnipotence, omniscience, and his goodness. So my first question in regards to that proposal is, how could it be that the God is limited in power? And how could it be that a God is limited in its goodness?
Yeah, I find people do struggle with this a little bit. A lot of people say to me, "Well, what's constraining God? There must be something outside of God." I had a debate with the atheist celeb, YouTube celeb, Alex O'Connor, who was saying that, "Oh, there's something constraining." Well, no, that's not the thought. It's just that every theory of reality has to take something as basic and unexplained, whether that's God or the Big Bang or the laws of nature. You have to take something as just that's our starting point. So I suppose on this view, it would just be a starting point that God can do some things and can't do others. Maybe God can only create from a very simple starting point, a singularity like the Big Bang. God can't just create complex life. God can only create from a singularity. God can only create physics with a certain structure. And the joy. I mean, what we want from our primitives is that they're fairly simple. Right. Ultimately, I think in scientific philosophy, we want the simplest theory that accommodates the data. I think this can be expressed quite simply, right? If you take physics, take the numbers out, and then that leaves you with a structure, and then you just say, well, God can only create the universe with that structure, but can fiddle with the numbers. That's that's simpler than physics, right? Because you're taking out the numbers. So if it's simpler than physics, well, that's got to be good for me. And look, I mean, even just finally, traditional theists say to me, but God has to be beyond explanation, the ultimate. Well, look, I mean, even if you believe in traditional theism, there's something that's not explained, or at least something we don't understand the explanation of. Just the existence of God. Why is there this all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good being? Well, what explains that? Rather than nothing. And so I'm maybe adding a little bit more complexity, a bit more of a primitive, saying, well, God's limited in some ways. I am persuaded by traditional theists that that's a bit more complicated, because just to say God can do everything is very simple, but you're saying, no, God can do this and can't do that. God can create a universe but can't fiddle afterwards. But it's still fairly simple. And so, yeah, everyone has to have something that's brute and unexplained. I think it's a very simple way of explaining the data as we find it.
That's interesting. Yeah, yeah. In some ways, there has to be some explanation for whatever claim that you're making, right? For the property of God. So for a traditional theist who says that God is all powerful, well, then I could equally ask, well, why is this God all powerful? Why aren't his powers
Yeah.
limited, right? And there has to be some explanation. But I do see this point. There seems to be something slightly more complicated about the claim that you're making, which is like, okay, well, this God, all he can do is push the first domino.
Yeah.
Right, and it's like, well, why? Why couldn't he have pushed the fifth domino? Like, there seems to be some arbitrary line
Oof.
that's drawn there that doesn't have to be drawn for a traditional theist who just says that God is all powerful.
I think there's something to that. Here's an analogy from the very good um, traditional Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne, who I debated on my book when it came out on the unbelievable YouTube channel Christians versus non-Christians debating, and he's incredible. I mean, he's just had his 90th birthday, and he was on a YouTube channel debating me on this, and he's quite incredible. I forgot what I was saying. Oh yeah, so he has this. Apparently, I'm just trusting his word on this. Before we knew the precise speed of velocity of the speed of light, we thought we took it that light was infinite in speed. And why? Because infinity and zero are very simple, right? Anything in between is like, why is it exactly that number? Why is it infinity and zero are the simplest numbers? But as soon as we did get evidence to the contrary, we don't tie ourselves in knots trying to say, oh, maybe it's still infinite. We just say, okay, it's got that value. So I actually think this analogy from Swinburne works against him because, yeah, I'm inclined to agree with him that his view of God is simpler. God's just all powerful. That's a very simple claim. So I agree with him against sort of Richard Dawkins and stuff who says God isn't. I think God is very simple hypothesis. But my view is a little bit less simple, but to account for the data better. And I think that's what we should do. We shouldn't tie ourselves in knots trying to sort of, as theologians do, to try and say why God allows sufferings. That just make the hypothesis a little bit, not, you don't want it to be crazy complicated, a little bit less complicated. Sorry, a little bit less simple, a little bit more complicated to fit the data better. And so that's what I think I'm doing. And look, maybe if you really understood the nature of whether you're a traditional theist or my kind of weird God, maybe if you really understood the nature of God in the life to come, you just see, oh my God, I see why God has to exist and God has to be like that, But in either case, this is just something beyond human comprehension. So all we can do is try and do what we always do, try and work out the simplest hypothesis that deals with the data. And I think, limited God looks pretty good, even though culturally it feels weird for both theists and atheists.
All right, so let's move onto the second proposal, which was teleological natural laws, right? Or teleological laws of physics, or I don't know what you want to call them. So one example that I was thinking about was something like evolution, right? There seems to be maybe some sort of telos, right? Which is the survival of the species, or the survival of the gene, I guess, right? And then that leads to changes in the body, and eventually it gets passed on and stuff like that, right? So it seems like there is some sort of telos that it's involved without a designer. So is that what you mean, but just on the universe scale?
I would say that's an interesting analogy. I suppose I would say with evolution, it seems like no. I mean, I think different biologists and philosophers of biology would think about this in different ways, but I think everyone would agree this is non-fundamental teleology. Um, so yeah, maybe in some sense there's teleological directedness towards complex survival machines, but natural selection gives us an explanation of that. That once you have, as Darwin showed, certain situations that organisms that can reproduce and pass on characteristics and a competitive environment, it becomes sort of highly likely that over time you're going to get complicated survival mechanisms. So what I'm saying is you don't need fundamental teleology, right? Because natural selection explains away the non-fundamental teleology. So I guess the standard Darwinian is going to think, at the fundamental level of physics, you don't have teleology. You've just got causation where it's all about the past influencing the future. So what I'm exploring in the book is a very different kind of law of nature, where it's not past to present laws of nature as we standardly think of them. What's going to happen at the next moment based on what was a moment before. Instead, we have future to present laws of nature which push things towards a certain goal. So things might happen in the present moment in order to get closer to the emergence of life, for example. And that's just a fundamental fact. So there's not a God designing things in that way. It's just part of the fundamental causal workings of the universe. And as I said, there are ways you could actually render all this a little bit precise, which was explored, for example, in Thomas Nagel's book Mind and Cosmos in 2012. Very interesting book. It's interesting that he got absolutely slammed. In a way, I don't think my book has been quite as slammed. And I don't think it's because it's a better book. I'm certainly not a better philosopher than Thomas Nagel. I just think that's we're seeing history in action, that there's a little bit of a greater, it's still a hostility, a little bit of a greater openness to these ideas than previously. I got a 5-star review in Popular Science magazine. The author said this is all wrong, but it's interesting, a good book. A lot of the reviews were like that, wrong, but a good book. But I can cope with that. So yeah. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit now.
Okay, so I'm just trying to get a better understanding of this type of teleological law of nature. So
Yeah.
where, why would there be teleological laws of nature?
Well, I guess, Jason, this just comes back again to everyone has to start somewhere, right? And that you've got your evidence, and you want to account for the evidence. And we could talk about Bayes' theorem that tells us how that works, the relation of evidential support. there are many, there are always an infinite number of things you can postulate to account for the evidence, but you want to go for the simplest. So we do have this. I mean, put it this way, right? Either the fine tuning is just an incredible fluke that of all the values these constants could have had, they just happen to have the ones compatible with life, or there's something in reality that ensured that or made it likely, some kind of directedness towards the emergence of life. And I suppose the simplest way of making sense of that is just to say it's just primitive. It's a primitive directedness towards life. So yeah, I mean, why do we postulate anything in science or philosophy or to account for the data? And yeah,
Okay, so then this teleological law of nature approach, this is simply consisting of the acknowledgement of the fine-tuning problem. Like if we just accept that the universe has been somehow fine-tuned for the creation of life and perhaps, sentient life, and we just kind of like stop it there. We don't provide any explanation for why those laws exist the way that they do. Is that just accepting the position of a teleological law of nature?
I suppose so. And we get a bit. The problem I have a lot on Twitter at the moment is people think on misunderstanding what fine tuning means because people think it's. I mean, it sounds like it implies design, doesn't it, or purpose, like somebody's fine tuning. Whereas the way it's standardly understood in both physics and philosophy, it doesn't imply that. It's, I suppose, a bit of a metaphor to old-fashioned radios where you twiddle the dials. It just means that for life to be possible, the numbers had to fall in this certain narrow range. So you're going beyond that basic, broadly accepted data. But yes, insofar as you're accepting that there is directedness towards life, and I suppose you could use the word fine-tuned to mean that's fine-tuned for life in the sense that there is intention, purpose. But yeah, I suppose in a way you're just taking it as primitive. But you don't have to just say, oh, well, that's it. As I say, you can, and this has been, I mean, it was spelt out originally by Daniel Nolan and John Hawthorne, two of our most esteemed, very techie philosophers who like technical details. And, they gave us quite a rigorous way of cashing this out in terms of state space and stuff. And, and roughly the idea was, very roughly, that because there's a question like, well, how do these teleological laws interact with the standard laws of physics? And roughly the idea is that when things are left indeterminate or open by when X and Y, when two options X and Y are left open by the non-teleological laws, then the teleological laws kick in. So if the non-teleological laws leave it open that X could happen or Y could happen, well, then the teleological laws ensure that X happens, right? Because that's the one it's going to get us closer to life. Did I say that? I think, let me say that again. If the non-teleological laws leave it open that X could happen or Y could happen, and as it happens, X is going to get us closer to life, well, then the teleological laws kick in and ensure that X happens because that's the one that's going to get us closer to life. So yeah, so it will be a primitive feature of the theory that there is this push towards getting close to certain goals, but it's something we can lay out quite rigorously, precisely, even mathematically to an extent.
Okay, so let's talk about panpsychism, right? The idea is that the universe itself is conscious, right? So by that, do you mean that the universe itself just has a mind?
Yeah, so that sounds quite weird at first to say the universe is a mind. My niece is studying physics at Manchester University at the moment, and I'm not hearing from a physics class that physicists are telling us that our current theories tell us that the universe is a kind of mind. So, there's a natural question: well, how could these fit together? Our standard physics and cosmology and this idea that the universe is a mind. But what the contemporary panpsychist philosophy draws on is some really interesting work from the 1920s by Bertrand Russell and others. And what I think of as Russell's great insight was pointing out that physics is just mathematics. Math, as you guys say. Maths, as we say. It's just sort of mathematical structure. It's just a bunch of equations. And so, in a sense, physics isn't really telling us what the universe is. It's just telling us its mathematical structure. As Stephen Hawking said, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe. So, as far as physics is concerned, the universe could be anything really, as long as it has the right mathematical structure. That's all physics cares about. If we personify physics for a moment, physics says, I don't care what the universe is, just make sure it has the right mathematical structure. So then us panpsychists say, I can come in here. Maybe the universe is a conscious mind, right? Maybe it's a conscious mind, a very weird kind of conscious mind. It's not an evolved conscious mind like you or I. It's a very weird, it's just got this very complicated experience structure in its experience corresponding to the complexity of the physical universe. But as long as that complex conscious experience, let's say the field of consciousness, if you like, of the universe, as long as it has the right kind of mathematical structure, then you're going to be able to get physics out of that, right? That's all physics and cosmology tell us about the mathematical structure of the universe. So as long as this cosmic mind has the right mathematical structure, then it gives us everything physics needs. So this is not sort of saying, oh, there's the stuff physics talks about, and then there's this conscious mind. It's a way of explaining the story from physics in terms of some underlying story about consciousness. And so it ends up being actually quite a parsimonious theory, surprisingly. The consciousness of the universe is just what fills out, what realizes the mathematical structures of physics. Of course, you still have to have a reason to believe in it. But I mean, I've argued at length there are independent reasons through reflecting on the science and philosophy of consciousness to take panpsychism seriously. Hey, now we've also got this other reason, fine-tuning, right? We can save ourselves postulating a supernatural designer by just supposing that what fills out the mathematical structures of physics is some kind of underlying consciousness. So as you might see, obviously, people think about kind of wacky, extravagant views. I'm actually trying to work out the most simple theory to accommodate what I take to be very real, empirical, or philosophical data points.
Oh, thank you for that. So is the idea that the universe as either is a conscious mind or has a conscious mind, and that this conscious mind wants there to be life in the universe, and that's why there's life?
In some sense, but we mustn't be too anthropocentric about it, thinking this is the kind of mind we are, we've evolved in a very specific environment for a very specific purpose. Our minds are very flexible and adjusted to the survival conditions we find ourselves in. I suppose the idea might be that this is just a very different kind of mind, but a mind that in some sense is directed at certain goals, is in some sense aware of the options available to it and aware of the ultimate consequences of some of the options available to it, and can select between them on the basis of their propensity to get it nearer to certain goals. So this would be actually a very different kind of conscious cognition and conscious mental life to what a human being has. So it's not like the universe thinking, oh, what am I going to do today? I want to do this. It would be a very alien, odd kind of goal directedness. But yeah, that's roughly the idea. And I try to be a bit more precise about it and in the book, but that's the rough idea, yes.
Okay. So of the three, which do you prefer?
Well, what I say, I think all of these should be taken seriously. I just want to get a discussion going. People get stuck in these dichotomies of thought. I think that, is it sort of US capitalism or Soviet communism? Is it God or atheism? Is it the soul or is consciousness just the brain? We ignore this wealth of options in between. I suppose what I say in the book, at least in terms of the data points I'm considering in the book, the third option we've considered, cosmopsychism, seems to me to have the edge because I think it has the balance of parsimony and explanation. So if you just have the teleological laws, that is just a sort of brute. It, it would be nice to have a slightly deeper level of explanation. So postulating some kind of conscious mind underlying the goal directedness gives us a deeper level of explanation, but it's also more parsimonious than a supernatural designer. Rather than postulating something outside of the universe, you can get that expansionary gain on the cheap, right, by just filling out the structures of physics with the cosmic mind. So yeah, I tend to think cosmopsychism has the edge, but all of these views need to be thought about. Maybe there's other considerations outside of the book that might push us in one direction or another.
Okay. Uh, this has been a very informative interview because I know almost nothing about this subject. It's not my area of specialization. Mine is ethics, and specifically bioethics. But so I'm trying to figure out what implication this argument has on, I guess, us as human beings, as as the rational animal. So let's say that the universe is conscious and it is somehow directed towards life. Are you saying that that is the purpose of the universe? Life is the purpose of the universe?
Yeah, I always think these are both important and separate questions. Most of the book is just the cold-blooded scientific philosophical case for these positions to take them seriously, at least. But then there's questions you're rightly raising now. How does this affect us? How does this impact the meaning and purpose of our lives? And you could, a colleague of mine sort of hears my argument from fine tuning and things. Yeah, yeah, okay, there's a good case, common purpose. I don't care though. I've got my own life, I've got my own goals, and um, I think that's a consistent position. I explore this in a lot of different ways in the book. I suppose what I've come to think is a sort of middle way position. One extreme position says if there's no purpose to the universe, that's it. It's all pointless. It's all meaningless. We might as well just kill ourselves. Um, at the other extreme, you've got my colleague's position saying, "Oh, it's just cosmic purpose. And it doesn't matter. Who cares? We make our own purpose." I suppose what I'm inclined to think is you can have a perfectly meaningful life without any of this, through doing things that are worthwhile. Kindness, creativity, the pursuit of knowledge. These are all intrinsically wonderful things. But there's maybe the possibility for more purpose if there is a purpose beyond human beings, if there is a greater purpose to the universe as a whole. I mean, we want our lives to make a difference. If you can contribute in some small way to the ultimate purpose of everything, that's huge. That's about as big a purpose that's about as big a difference as you can imagine making. So yeah, so I think there is that potential to make a difference to our lives. But actually, your question, I mean, what is the purpose of the universe? Is this maybe it was just life, intelligent life, and maybe that's the end of it? Yeah, that's it. But then I'd be quite surprised once you take cosmic purpose seriously. I think it'd be a bit surprising if we happen to be living at the final culmination. So maybe it's not it. Maybe there's more to come. Maybe there's a greater purpose will one day emerge as unfathomable to us as our existence is to worms. And maybe one can live in hope of that greater purpose and hope that the good that one does can somehow contribute to that greater purpose. Of course, at this point, it's very wildly speculative, but I don't think there's anything wrong with living in hope of something if it gives your life meaning, if it gives you motivation, if there's some kind of rational basis for it, as long as you're accepting the level of uncertainty and you're willing to take that leap of faith, I think there can be a justification for that.
This discussion reminds me of why I think religion is so attractive to some people, which is that it supposedly answers the vast majority of the big questions that we have, right? The purpose of the universe, why we are here, how we're supposed to live, right? And whereas I don't think anything else comes even close. Nothing, other systematic ideology can answer those questions in the same to the same extent that religion can. Religion can give you a comprehensive conception of the good. Atheism cannot do that. There's nothing that the atheist can offer that comes even close, right? So when you're giving these different options to kind of explain the data and like why the universe is just fine tuned the way that it is, of course, the traditional theist has that answer as well as other answers, important answers, to the questions that we have, right? Whereas if you have some sort of teleological law of nature approach or the panpsychism approach, even if they can answer that a particular question, they cannot answer other questions that we care about, right? So on the whole, they're less attractive, even if on this particular issue, they're more attractive.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. I suppose what I articulate in the Why book is that I'm always the middle way guy. I mean, I suppose, yeah, one hand you've got atheists saying there is no purpose to the universe. On the other hand, you might have a very well worked out religion that tells you this is what the purpose of the universe is, and this is what you need to do, and this is what's going to happen. I suppose that the position I articulate in Why is somewhere in the middle, saying that there is a purpose to the universe. It's very uncertain what it is. Maybe there's suggestions that there's something good coming out of this. If you look at what life, I think why we're struck by the fine tuning is that life is of inherent value. Life is, if you look at the simulations physicists offer, that the different universes that would have emerged from different numbers, most of them have little or no value. A lot of them have just hydrogen, the simplest element. So it's just not, or if the cosmological constant that governs the propulsion of the universe, if it had been a little bit stronger, everything would have shot apart so quickly, no two particles would have ever met. If it had been a little bit weaker, everything would have collapsed back on itself a split second after the Big Bang. So, there's nothing of any interest or value in these universes. So what's striking about the fine tuning is it's this narrow range where you can have structure, value, people falling in love and writing poetry. So that suggests to me that there is a directedness towards something of value, but where that's headed is fine tuning doesn't give you any more directedness. But I think one can exaggerate the specificities of the traditional religions. I mean, Christianity, I think is in some sense a little bit like quantum mechanics in that. The core of Christianity, like what the Jesus stuff was all about, there's huge disagreement on what people think it's. There's this idea popular in US evangelical that it's all about God needed someone to punish for our sins, and so Jesus took the rap so we can go to heaven. I mean, that is a very historically almost non-existent version of Christianity. Whereas in Eastern Orthodox Church, you've got this idea that no, it's nothing to do with sin. It's the point of the Jesus stuff is God and the universe coming into unity. God becoming more like us so we can become more like God. So actually, there's some specificities in Christianity, sort of Jesus is God and stuff like that. But what the hell is going on, and where's it going? And is there hell or not? Are animals involved in this? There's a great deal of uncertainty there as well. So and maybe it doesn't make as much difference as one might imagine, but I'm just thinking on my feet.
I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, just throw in at the end. I mean, since I wrote the book, I've sort of embraced a kind of what I call a heretical version of Christianity, which I think surprisingly fits quite well with this God of limited powers business, and fits better with the Eastern Orthodox version of Christianity I mentioned a moment earlier. And I've got an article with E on if people wanna learn more about that. So that was the surprising development since the book. But yeah, you keep on thinking. Probably I'll be an atheist next week. Who knows? But no, it's been a very nice discussion, Jason. Thank you for engaging with me. And more people, if people want to, I always argue on Twitter as well. If people want to, well, I'm on Twitter, and all the liberals have gone to Blue Sky now, and so I'm decided to do both. So I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky, Philip_Goff, just to you know not make my mind up.
All right.
But yeah, I like to argue. If anyone wants to come and argue, if you don't agree with any of it, I'm sure everyone's totally convinced. But if anyone is not convinced by any of it and wants to argue, you can do that.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.